The national media storm surrounding Caitlin Clark has officially exploded into something far bigger than fan debates or social media trends. What once sounded like passionate support from Clark's loyal fanbase is now being echoed by some of the most respected and influential voices in mainstream sports media, and that changes everything. The WNBA leadership and the Indiana Fever front office can no longer brush aside the conversation with carefully crafted PR statements or routine organizational messaging. Because when veteran analysts, national broadcasters, and trusted sports commentators all begin reaching the exact same conclusion, the narrative shifts from opinion into undeniable basketball reality. And now, one of the biggest names in sports media has taken that conversation to an entirely different level. Colin Cowherd has reignited the Caitlin Clark debate with a comparison so massive, so bold, that it instantly sent shockwaves across the sports world. On his national platform, Cowherd compared Clark directly to Michael Jordan, not as a casual hot take, but as a serious statement about transformational influence, cultural impact, and the ability to completely reshape a league's visibility. And whether critics want to admit it or not, that comparison is forcing the entire basketball world to confront a question that can no longer be ignored. Is Caitlin Clark becoming the defining superstar the WNBA has been searching for all along?
So Caitlin Clark, third season in the WNBA, has already set the record. She had another game in which she had at least 20 points and 10 assists. And I have been saying when she broke into the league, people said her comp is Steph Curry. Now, I think stylistically, the way she plays her game has got some Steph Curry. I think, though, in terms of an iconic player, she's more Michael Jordan.
Not in terms of championships, statistics, or identical playing style, but in terms of the rare competitive mentality that made Michael Jordan the most feared and influential player basketball has ever seen. Absolute fearlessness under pressure. That was the core of Colin Cowherd's comparison to Caitlin Clark. It wasn't about copying Jordan's game. It was about possessing the same ice-cold mentality when the moment becomes overwhelming for everyone else. The deep clutch three-pointer Clark drilled with defenders closing in, the game hanging in the balance, and pressure reaching its highest level, Cowherd pointed directly at that moment and said, "That's what Jordan did." That willingness to embrace the biggest moment instead of shrinking from it is what separates truly transcendent competitors from athletes who are simply talented. Because most players feel pressure. Rare players attack it. And according to Cowherd, Clark belongs in that rare category. That comparison carries enormous weight because it moves beyond highlight reels and fan excitement into something deeper, observable competitive behavior. On one of the biggest sports platforms in America, Cowherd openly suggested that Clark possesses the same psychological edge that defined Jordan's legendary career, the complete absence of fear when fear would be natural for almost anyone else. For longtime Clark supporters, this is exactly what they've been arguing for years. Her ability to attempt and consistently make impossible shots in the most critical moments feels less like learned skill and more like an instinctive competitive gift. You cannot teach that kind of mentality. Coaches can refine mechanics, improve decision-making, and sharpen fundamentals, but they cannot manufacture the internal wiring that makes an athlete crave pressure instead of avoiding it. And that is why the conversation around Caitlin Clark is becoming impossible to contain. More and more national voices are beginning to recognize that her impact goes beyond statistics or entertainment. There is a growing belief that Clark represents a level of competitive intensity and star power that appears only once in a generation. The kind of athlete who changes not only games, but the entire energy surrounding a sport.
So Jordan walked into the NBA. He was a rookie sensation. Year 2, he got hurt. Year 3, he was like the best player in the league, arguably, and he then needed his Pippen, got it in year 4. So Caitlin comes into the league, rookie sensation. Year 2, last year she's hurt. Year 3, okay, her stats are great again. When is she going to start winning at the next level? She has not won a playoff series yet. And so my take is she has her Pippen. Kelsey Mitchell was a player that got some MVP votes. And this is not like hating on Caitlin Clark, but the stage of, wow, who's the new kid? I'm done with that. That was awesome. That was Taylor Swift's self-titled album. Oh my God, who's that? And then it was Fearless, which crushed her self-titled album.
This is no longer just passionate fan hype or internet exaggeration surrounding Caitlin Clark. What we are witnessing now is validation, confirmation from respected national sports voices that the competitive fearlessness people have been describing for years is absolutely real. And the evidence keeps piling up. It appears in the record books she continues to rewrite. It appears in the fourth quarter performances that have repeatedly shifted games this season. It appears in those audacious logo threes launched under maximum pressure, shots most players would never even consider attempting with the game hanging in the balance. But Clark not only takes those shots, she makes them, and she does it with a level of confidence that feels almost unnatural. That is the difference. When pressure rises, most athletes instinctively become cautious. They simplify, they hesitate, they choose the safer option to avoid failure. But Clark consistently moves in the opposite direction. She chooses the difficult shot, the impossible passing angle, the aggressive read that carries enormous risk, and somehow executes it anyway. Again and again, those decisions are producing winning plays, historic numbers, and moments that completely shift the momentum of games. That is why Colin Cowherd's comments landed with so much force. Because he was not reacting emotionally to one highlight. He was identifying a recurring pattern of elite competitive behavior that mirrors the mentality displayed by the greatest closers in basketball history, including Michael Jordan. But Cowherd took the conversation even further, into territory that directly challenges the structure surrounding Clark inside the Indiana Fever organization. According to Cowherd, the issue is no longer whether Clark is the right player. In his view, she has already proven she possesses generational-level talent and mentality. The bigger concern is whether she has the right coaching system around her to fully maximize that talent. That observation instantly intensified the debate surrounding the Fever's leadership and coaching direction. Because when a player demonstrates this level of vision, shot creation, composure, and offensive command, expectations naturally shift toward the coaching staff to build a system capable of unleashing it consistently. And now the national media is beginning to openly ask the same uncomfortable question fans have been asking for months. Is Caitlin Clark being elevated to her full potential, or is a historic talent being limited by the system around her?
I need Fearless. This is great. I've seen the stats. She shoots from a long way away from the basket. That is awesome. But there are stages to greatness. And I've always felt her game is Steph. I think she has a chance to be Jordan-esque, which is multiple championships if she can get the right coach and the right running mate. And I think she has that player.
What made Colin Cowherd's comments so impactful was the precision of the distinction he made. He separated Caitlin Clark from the environment surrounding her and argued that the real issue is not the player's ability, mentality, or production. It is the system attempting to contain that talent. In Cowherd's view, there is a growing gap between what Clark is capable of becoming and what the current coaching structure with the Indiana Fever is actually allowing her to fully display. And according to him, that gap is no longer a minor concern or temporary growing pain. It is becoming a major organizational problem that the franchise cannot continue to ignore. That statement carries enormous significance because it is coming from a massive national media platform, not just passionate fan discussions online. When a veteran sports commentator openly says, "The problem is the coaching, not the player," it changes the entire framing of the conversation. Suddenly, every substitution pattern, offensive adjustment, late-game decision, and usage strategy comes under a much brighter spotlight. And Cowherd is far from the only mainstream voice beginning to question the narrative surrounding Clark. During national coverage, Kate Scott also delivered pointed commentary about the way Clark's performances are often discussed publicly, particularly when it comes to turnovers. Scott criticized the tendency to isolate Clark's turnover numbers without properly acknowledging the massive offensive responsibility she carries every single game. Because context matters. Players who control the ball constantly, create offense for entire teams, attempt high-risk passes, stretch defenses from impossible shooting range, and dictate tempo at all times will naturally commit turnovers at a higher rate than lower usage players. That has historically been true for elite playmakers across every era of basketball. What Scott highlighted was the imbalance in the conversation. Critics often magnify Clark's mistakes while minimizing the extraordinary production attached to those risks: the deep shooting, elite court vision, transition creation, scoring gravity, and offensive pressure she generates on nearly every possession. And that growing frustration from national broadcasters signals something important. The mainstream media conversation around Caitlin Clark is evolving rapidly. It is no longer centered only on hype or popularity. More analysts are beginning to frame her as a transformational talent whose ceiling may ultimately depend on whether the system around her evolves quickly enough to match the level of player she already appears to be becoming.
Tonight, Caitlin Clark has been responsible for 38 of Indiana's 77 points so far.
Yeah, and I feel like that's worth mentioning, LaChina, because we all read the comments, right? We see that some folks have a problem with how much Caitlin turns the ball over, right? They're always looking for something. As the Storm and Stephanie Dolson start us off here in this fourth quarter. So I looked things up, just comparing to the WNBA, leaders in assists. Nikola Jokic, about 10 assists a game, 4 turnovers a game. Kate Cunningham, who I know is playing a big game 7 tonight, about 9.5 assists per game, 4 turnovers a game. So calm down, everybody.
When you're handling the ball all the
time,
you are going to have turnovers. But the question for you is, you read the comments?
Just when they're about other people.
That's a dangerous place to be.
Why are people...
Kate Scott publicly challenging the selective criticism surrounding Caitlin Clark was more than just a passing broadcast comment. It was a direct challenge to a narrative that has followed Clark since the moment she entered professional basketball. Yes, the turnovers exist. Nobody serious denies that. They are visible in the box scores, discussed constantly by analysts and repeatedly highlighted by critics who frame them as proof of recklessness or a limitation. But what Scott pointed out is the context that too often gets intentionally ignored. Clark's turnovers are inseparable from the extraordinary offensive burden she carries and the aggressive playmaking style that creates elite scoring and assist production at historic levels. Players who constantly attempt high-level reads, push pace, manipulate defenses, and create offense from impossible angles will inevitably produce mistakes alongside brilliance. That has always been true for transformational playmakers in basketball history. The problem, according to Scott and many others, is that Clark's mistakes are frequently isolated and amplified while her unprecedented production is treated as secondary. And now the numbers themselves are beginning to overwhelm the criticism. At this moment, Clark sits among the league's top scorers in a WNBA filled with established stars, MVP winners, and elite veterans. Aya Wilson and other dominant names remain central figures in the MVP conversation, but Clark's scoring output and late-game heroics are forcing the national media to reconsider how quickly her impact is accelerating. What makes this even more remarkable to many observers is the belief that Clark is producing these performances without operating inside a system fully optimized for her strengths. Critics of the current coaching approach argue that the Indiana Fever offense has too often disrupted her rhythm, limited her freedom in key stretches, and structured possessions in ways that reduce her natural control over the game. That is where the comparison to Phil Jackson and Lisa Blutta enters the conversation. Supporters of this argument believe Blutter's greatest strength at University of Iowa was not simply designing plays, it was creating an environment that fully trusted Clark's instincts. Blutter allowed her to operate freely, take deep shots without fear of punishment, make real-time reads, and embrace the aggressive creativity that defines her identity as a player. That freedom transformed Clark from a talented recruit into the most influential figure in women's college basketball history. The comparison to Phil Jackson is philosophical more than tactical. Jackson famously built systems that amplified the instincts of transcendent players like Michael Jordan rather than suppressing them into rigid conformity. Many analysts now argue that Clark thrives best under the same type of coaching trust, an environment where her ambition is expanded instead of restricted. This is why some voices have openly suggested that the Fever should pursue a coaching structure more aligned with Clark's natural game, whether through someone like Blutta or legendary basketball mind Cheryl Miller. The larger argument is not necessarily about one specific coach being the only answer. It is about the growing perception that the current arrangement may not fully maximize a generational player. And that perception is becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss because the media conversation is evolving beyond fandom into broad analytical consensus. Colin Cowherd openly discussing coaching limitations, Kate Scott challenging uneven criticism, and national commentators comparing Clark's mentality to Jordan's competitive fearlessness all point toward the same conclusion. The debate is no longer about whether Caitlin Clark is capable of becoming one of the defining players in WNBA history. The debate is whether the environment around her will rise quickly enough to match the level of talent already standing in front of it.